As I was looking back into some of my previous podcast materials, I stumbled onto another interesting story related to the Philpott Land Appropriation. So I've decided this week to share that story with you. It's a story of service and duty, of intrigue and cover-ups, of lost love and abandonment surrounding the life of one man who came to Canada enlisted to fight in the French and Indian War. This war occurred in a 7-year period from 1754 to 1763. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the world at this time to get a feel for the politics. Russia held Alaska, and Spain held the western side of the continent, from Alaska through BC to Texas. They also held Florida and Cuba. The French sat between the Spanish and the British in the interior in a region called Louisiana. A lot of the settlements were run by independent French traders. Think of them like profiteering merchants with very little oversight. They set up slave plantations in New Orleans, Biloxi, Mississippi, Mobile, and Alabama. They sent out Jesuit missionaries to convert the natives to Christianity. The natives were attacking their forts as they attempted to placate them with gifts. Slave plantations in the Spanish and French colonies in these regions were blamed for smallpox. Within Canada, the French stuck to the fur trading. Their settlements were concentrated along the St. Lawrence River, in Quebec, New Brunswick, and Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. They had military trading forts further down the river in Montreal, Frontenac, which would have been around Kingston, Niagara, Detroit, and in Michigan. These forts had no surrounding colonists, but were used to supply the interior colonies. The British were holding the colonies on the eastern coast, from Newfoundland to Georgia in the south. Nova Scotia had been captured by the French in 1713, but still held a significant French-speaking population there. The British held sole rights to trade with natives around Hudson's Bay, which included northern Ontario, northern Quebec, and interior Canada, which is northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. One interesting fact is the Hudson Bay areas are still mostly only occupied by native peoples today. So the war itself sparked from a conflict going on in Europe called King George's War in 1744. It was an inheritance war. The last Habsburg male had died, so they wanted to put his daughter on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Because she was a woman, this was not allowed due to the laws at the time. They had to seek authority from the Catholic Church, as well as the other country's nobles. The French wanted to back a lesser male relative who had married into the family, instead of a blood relative, and this sparked a war in Europe. The British were diplomatically obliged to join their allies, the Austrians, against the French. They didn't officially declare war with the French until 1744 due to a battle fought in Europe with them. And at this time, the war was only in Europe. The first attack in North America was a raid by the French on a Nova Scotian fishing port called Canso. The French Catholics living in the area didn't want British Protestants moving in. They talked the natives, who they had been converting to Catholics, into attacking forts there. Not all of them were converted, but they all agreed that the incoming population numbers were concerning for their tribes. So it was very easy to prey on their fears. When the French and Indian War broke out, the French were outnumbered 20-1. Think about it. British settlers did their own farming, or used indentured servants instead of slaves. These are people who are given land in return for years of work. So overall, they had more settlers to participate in the war. They didn't have slaves. Slaves weren't going to help the French folks fight wars, were they? This made the French dependent on their native allies, and they started talking several tribes into aiding them, which, again, we can see this is a tactic they've used many times in history. The region that made up the, let's just say the war zone, was on land occupied by the natives sitting between the French and the British. So without their participation, the French and British would not be warring here. The attack through the lands forced other native tribes to take sides in the conflict to defend themselves. Nobody wanted to lose lands to a competing native tribe, the British or the French. Once everyone was engaged, it pretty much became a free-for-all. Basically, the native tribes would support different sides depending on who was their better trading partner at the time. or perhaps which side scared them more. At this time in the war, the British had the support of the Iroquois and the Cherokee living south of the Great Lakes. The French had no troops in the Americas since their settlements were run by those independent traders. They had only 3,000 colonial soldiers here. Virginia, on the other hand, was better equipped. So the French were scrambling, trying to figure out how to protect their assets. The French started recruiting native fighters from closer to their forts in the Great Lakes regions, even though this territory itself was not subject to war. Also at this time, the colonies of Virginia and Pennsylvania were competing for territory between each other. They were arguing over a region south of Lake Erie. The British had gotten permission to put a fort there from natives in the area at what would have been now Pittsburgh. They had asked the French to pull back in this region. Now this is the notable site of the famous smallpox blanket story, where blankets were supposedly provided to native tribes that spread that illness. This story occurred at the end of the war, in a region which had just been won and ceded to the British. The natives had asked the British to pull out. Now, you gotta remember, these natives have been attacking British soldiers. They're slaughtering French settlers in the region who are sick with smallpox, sending them to the fort, to the hospital there. The British pretty much said, no, that's okay. If you want, we'll continue the war. So the natives said, we'll take this thought back to our leaders. And the leaders of the fort said, here, take these blankets, which theoretically might have been contaminated. So this is a time where the British had not yet had colonists moving into the area. They just won the war. When did they have time to move in new settlers? There's smallpox in the region. The settlers aren't going to be there anytime soon. They're afraid of smallpox. So the troops are in the process of consolidating their losses, burying their dead, and garrisoning the region at this time. The sick people themselves were either the British soldiers who contracted the illness while fighting French and Indians, or were the French settlers themselves from the surrounding farms who were being slaughtered by those natives. Let's say, okay, maybe it was possible a blanket could give you smallpox, but wasn't it more possible that the native tribes using axes and bows attacking infected French colonists could have gotten blood spatter on themselves? I mean, blood spatter is a much more effective vector for getting smallpox than a blanket would be, who might have laid on a infected person. French colonists employed the North African slaves, which was the source region in their world, for the disease. They purchased some of these slaves from the Caribbean regions from the Spanish, who had records of contracting the smallpox and transmitting it through their slaves brought out of Incan territories in South America. I mean, okay, anyone with half a brain can see the British weren't the actual source of the infection, even if they might have been spreading it around a little. So, a dumb leader in this moment giving a native a blanket is not the cause of the infection. Not sure why the British took the blame for this one. Anyway, that is the state of the world at the time of the story I'd like to tell. You can see the heavy tensions between the natives, the French, and the British, and everyone's afraid of smallpox and illness and other people taking their land. Everyone's thoughts are caught up in thoughts of war. The Philpott family had come from Ireland 3 generations ago. They were living at the moment in New Hampshire, Portsmouth, in the British colonies. Their family captained a ship and participated in trade. The shipping manifests at Port Piscataqua showed that between 1743 and 1775, their family had several male relatives working together in their business. This story is about John Philpott, Captain James II's eldest son, born in 1735. Now their family maintained political connections through marriage to folks in the region. The most important of these families were the Wentworths. The Wentworths were governors in this region. Now, because John was Irish descent, his families were only allowed to marry lesser non-inheriting members of the Wentworths. His sisters married the 8th and 9th born children. James himself had married a Sarah Roberts in 1752. She was 9 years older than he was, but she was descended from the governor of Gloucester in the UK. He was her great-great-grandfather, so she was considered very politically important. He had a daughter with her, Abigail, in 1753. She died in childbirth, we think. So in 1754, a year after his wife's death, he remarried Kezia Wentworth. They had a daughter, Rachel, in 1755. We know that John himself was working as a mariner between 1751 and 1758 because his name was on the port manifest. Interestingly enough, he seemed to alternate between using his own name and his father's name, James. Perhaps he was James III. Now, this is about the time the war hit. Perhaps his wife talked him into military service, or he wanted to impress her family. We know sometime after the war started, he enrolled with the military on a ship called the Yarmouth. On December 25th, 1756, John joined the HMS Invincible as a private of Company 90. The Yarmouth had been assigned to go to India, halfway across the world. Perhaps he wanted to transfer to something a little closer to home. There were 12 men in this company under a second lieutenant, William Horsburgh. 4 of the people came with him from the Yarmouth. 6 more men transferred from a ship called the Royal Anne in January of 1757. The Invincible was a member of a fleet operating around Nova Scotia. It was tasked to take the fort at Louisbourg in the Cape Breton area. According to their muster records, their first expedition occurred between May 3rd to November 5th of 1757. They had a complement of 747 people. 642 were their own people, and 81 were taken aboard from other ships. So these are men living in very tight quarters. Philpott was a member of 105 Marines. He was one of 94 privates who were members of different companies. They had 9 officers with them and 2 drummers. Now, typically members of his role were responsible for vessel boarding and raids, and to maintain discipline while aboard the ship. During his service, there were several strange events that occurred. On June 17th, they recruited a boatswain's mate from the sea. A German man, Peter Petow, was taken from a small boat floating in the ocean and pretty much given a job. Not entirely sure I would have done that without knowing which ship he served on. On the same date, they acquired a French prisoner of war from the Hawk. This was a British merchant privateer, captained by a Richard Deek. The man's name was Anthony Laville. The HMS Invincible was a captured French ship. The British acquired it in 1747. It looked French, it was sailing in French waters. In times of war, I would have just assumed the man recovered from the sea was a French spy thinking you were a French vessel coming to save him. Maybe it was better to pretend to be German than admit you were French. At this time in history, Lord London and Benjamin Franklin had just left Philadelphia. London was to lead the ground forces in Nova Scotia. Franklin was going to England to dispute the taxes of landowners in Pennsylvania. The colonies were trying to figure out how to fund their defenses without support from England. Their ships traveled in a convoy together for protection, intending to split later on. We know London arrived in Nova Scotia in mid-July. On July 13th, we can see from the HMS Invincible muster records that the convoy reached Halifax. Sir Charles Hardy, the Rear Admiral of the Blue, came on board with 10 personal servants, 2 officers, and 7 sailors. Now, the new first lieutenant was a Frenchman, a William Dumarasque. He was one of 2 first lieutenants aboard. His mate was a German man, John Sayers. His mate was posted in the cockpit. Now, I'm surprised during the war with the French, they would allow a Frenchman to serve on a command ship. And why wouldn't they have come from the same ship as Hardy? Also suspiciously, we can see a secretary came on from the Arc-en-Ciel, a Thomas Palmer. This was a Captain John Roux's ship. He was the senior naval officer at Halifax during the previous conflicts. His former ship was the Success. Not one day after the secretary arrived and our new commander, the French prisoner was transferred to the Arc-en-Ciel. So let me get this straight. The man who used to be responsible for this area, a John Roux, transfers his secretary on, and not one day later the French prisoner's gone. No, not suspicious at all. On August 1st, a Lieutenant Patichel and Private Richardson transferred over from Halifax. They also took on an ordinary seaman, Davis. On August 3rd, they transfer out a Theophilus Rutt to the Success, John Roux's former ship. This is not a ship that's of their fleet. She was documented as attacking French fishing boats around Newfoundland. Apparently she was stationed briefly at Halifax. Their captain was Paul Henry Ory. This man was French. He was the second son of Louis Ory, a French Protestant of Blois. He supposedly had family issues which required him to take his ship back to England. Yeah, I mean, the guy's French. He probably just didn't want to fight a war against the French. It's curious, though. Why did they want this man? If we look at his registration, he came with a number or letter reference that was fairly illegible. Supposedly he had enrolled from Yarmouth on the same date as Philpot. There's not much else to go on about him, though. It says they chose to make him a lieutenant on the Success. On August 4th, they brought on a purser's mate from the Success, a William Cleve or Clove. A purser is someone who handles the money, cargo, and supplies. Okay, this looks very suspicious. The guy who's in charge of the Halifax area, which is a predominantly French area but British owned, gave his old ship to a Frenchman who went to the command vessel, took off a man and gave him a promotion to a lieutenant, and then transferred on someone who handles supplies and cargo. Clearly the French are interested in this ship's supplies, and they're messing around with this crew. Question is, why? On August 6th, a private was discharged as dead, John O'Brien. On August 7th, 3 sailors were discharged in Halifax, Robert Rowland and Thomas Duncalf as sick, and Richard Summers as dead. On August 15th, there was a fight between 2 seamen. John Fulton was killed, and Thomas Lloyd was sent to Halifax sick. On August 17th, Thomas Marsh, a private, was killed, while in Halifax. On August 19th, Giles Wakefield, another private, was lost at sea. On August 20th, James Higgs, a carpenter's crewmate, was lost at sea. On August 21st, John Kitchen, a seaman, was lost at sea. On August 26th, George Knott, another private, was killed while in Halifax. On September 2nd, Private James Stevens and Private John Peaton were discharged, but nobody knows where to. On September 4th, the captain's servant, Samuel Spikes, died. The day later, John Bryan was pressed from Halifax to replace him. So it looks to me that John Roux used his own vessel and the Success to steal supplies from the command vessel and cause disrest aboard the ship. They're very clearly removing the privates intended to keep ship security and causing fights among the other sailors. At this point, you can see they have 8 men there. The boatswain's mate, 2 lieutenants and 1 lieutenant's mate, a private, an ordinary seaman, a secretary, and a purser's mate. It's possible that that last captain's servant was also the 9th man of their group. They're clearly French saboteurs. From what we know of the French, London was supposed to be leading the ground forces against them there. The Acadian, Pierre Gautier, was leading the Micmac on 3 raids from Louisbourg to Halifax. The last was in September during these events. They killed and scalped 2 British men at Citadel Hill, but besides this, there was no notable documentation about battles on the ground. From French records, we can see they got reinforcement ships, but they didn't leave the harbor. They imply that they were hiding a typhus outbreak and a shortage of supplies. The French hijinks aboard took a pause as they met a British convoy on September 7th. About 3 days out from Halifax, they took on men from 9 ships. The Neptune was a British Navy ship captained by James Galbraith. Supposedly he was leading a convoy to supply troops for the ground assault at Louisbourg, before he was to return to France. The Essex was another British Navy vessel captained by a John Campbell. It had just taken the French privateer Le Comte de Saint-Florentin 3 leagues west of Scilly, and it was supposedly carrying her to Plymouth. Both the Neptune and the Essex were associated with Vice Admiral Charles Knowles. He was the governor at Louisbourg for 2 years in 1746 to 1748. He was supposed to be posted in France, but he had just been removed from the fleet there due to his failures. This man was married to a Frenchwoman, a Mary Magdalena Therese de Bouget, the daughter of Henry Francois, Comte de Bouget. He married her in Jamaica. He had also served as a governor there. This man later in life ended up defecting to Russia. No, not sketchy at all. The Perry, of which there is no record, might have been the Tilbury, which was built by Perry, commissioned by East India, known to be in this area, and was supposed to be handed over in October. The merchant ship Baltic was an American ship. Matilda was a British privateer, captained by Thomas Shaw. St. Andrew was a privateer captained by Andrew Sproul. He had a bad reputation for being a pirate and profiteer. He was employed in intercontinental slave trade before the war and was outfitting merchant ships for battle during it. He got accused of attacking a Spanish ship without permission. Now, there was no official record of the last 3 ships beyond their names, St. Celia, Modesty, and Brotherly Love. But their name symbology is interesting because all 3 of them are associated with Freemasons. St. Celia was a patron saint of musicians. The Freemasons of Scotland erected a music hall in her name in Edinburgh. Modesty was a statue of a veiled woman displayed in Vienna. She stands by a book that shows the words Veiled Truth. The sculptor was associated with the Freemasons. Benjamin Franklin, who was in the earlier convoy, was a Freemason. He wrote a parable on brotherly love. The city of brotherly love was supposed to be Philadelphia, where they had all left from. This kind of implies that these ships are part of Benjamin Franklin's convoy on the way back from England with support troops. He is documented as reaching England at the end of July. This implies it took about a month to supply the ships with food and men and return them to Nova Scotia. If we go back to HMS Invincible's muster book, we can see what was happening after this point. On September 8th, they took on 49 able seamen, or sailors, from these ships. 25 men were from the Essex, 4 were from the Baltic Merchant, 2 were from St. Andrew, 4 were from Matilda, and 4 were from Neptune. From those strange Freemason ships, they took 3 from St. Celia, 1 from Modesty, and 4 from the Brotherly Love. 3 of them were taken by special order, a Thomas Duffin, Thomas Granton, and George Harrison. 1 man was taken on board without a listed ship or a specific date. He was a John de Costa, but because there was another de Costa from the Matilda privateer, he was likely from this vessel. There was 1 person as well taken from the Perry, or Tilbury, who was also not listed with a given date, a David Freeman. The next day, the hijinks continued. On September 9th, William Hartley was discharged as per order of Charles Hardy. He had been one of the members who came on crew with him. But they were 3 days out from Halifax. Where did he go? On September 12th, they got back ashore in Halifax. 9 Marines were put ashore as sick. This is a corporal and 8 privates. 2 of the men were in Philpott's company, Roger Lee and Nicholas Kelly. Was the convoy attacked? Was there a mutiny or conflict on board the ship after they took on these men? Clearly, there were enough injured soldiers to send them to the infirmary. Something happened here. On September 17th, the surgeon's third mate was pronounced dead at sea. Now he was stationed as one of the cockpit mates with our German Sayers, a first lieutenant's mate, and that purser's mate, Clove. So two of the French sympathizers are, in his zone. Were they trying to recruit him to steal medical supplies and he refused to do it, so they had to kill him to protect their identities? On September 19th, 2 privates were moved to the Arc-en-Ciel. One of them was Gabriel Jones. This is another one of the men who Philpott had worked with on the Yarmouth. So, Roux transferred over 2 more privates. Did he kill these men and silently pretended they just transferred? Were they investigating the death of their surgeon's mate? Another seaman was also declared dead at sea this day. On September 20th, they landed at Halifax again. They took on 10 able seamen from the Tilbury and 10 from Orford. We know Tilbury just arrived, and the Orford was captained by Richard Spry, another senior officer at Halifax. So, these 2 ships in the Invincible were all members of Admiral Holborn's squadron pressed to attack Louisbourg. They'd been there since July, but nobody was attacking the city. We know that the French received reinforcements, and we know that they were having troubles on board the ships with sabotage. Perhaps that's why they weren't attacking the fort. On September 21st, another private died. They pressed 10 more men from the Windsor, one of the commanding vessels. The types of officers that were transferred with them tells us a lot about what was going on the vessel. They were a boatswain, which is a deck boss that maintains ships and manages equipment like small boats, a quartermaster who manages the storehouse and distributes supplies and provisions, and a gunner's mate who deals with ammunition. This implies that what the ship is dealing with here is sabotage. It's not illness. They're dealing with lack of supplies and theft of food and ammo, and possibly small vessels. These men were either put there to watch the resources or to steal them for the French. The problem is, after a point, it's not just the French stealing the supplies. You've got men who are terrified not being fed, stealing to save themselves. So you can see there's a clear problem on board the ship right now. On September 22nd, a quarter gunner and 5 more seamen got sick and were dropped off in Halifax. Did the new gunner's mate pick a fight with the quarter gunner? Was he a French saboteur? Now this is about the time where a hurricane was approaching Nova Scotia coming up the coast. Perhaps the folks could feel it coming. Maybe conditions aboard the ship were getting tense, and more people were getting frustrated and giving up. They were fighting a war of the minds at this point, more than a battle with weapons. On September 23rd, a seaman died in Halifax from illness. Another private was lost at sea. On September 24th, the Tilbury supposedly got hit by the storm. The captain and 120 members died at sea. The rest were French prisoners. This is interesting, though, because the hurricane was not documented as striking Cape Breton until the 25th. So what happened to the Tilbury? Did they sabotage and destroy the ship from within? Was it a plague ship, and they eliminated it to hide evidence of an illness? Documentation from the Invincible states they were sitting off the coast of Cape Breton, with the Sunderland, the Lightning, the Eagle, and the Orford. Records show that the Tilbury and the Ferret were lost. 200 men from the Tilbury ended up rescued by the French at the fort. They were supposedly recovered from St. Esprit Island, 50 kilometers to the southwest, and they were returned to Halifax. On September 25th, the Invincible was hit by the storm. They were the furthest south out of all the vessels, so they should have been hit first. They were demasted while traveling southeast toward Petit de Gras. On September 26th, they were 5 kilometers from shore. This is when John Philpott was lost at sea. He disappeared the day after the storm while waiting for towing. Now, he was a Marine, so he would have been responsible for keeping the ship orderly in a time where they're all freaking out because of the storm. Did they claim he died in a fight? We know he survived due to the existence of his descendants. So, what happened to him? We'll look at this shortly after I finish with the Invincible's muster record. On September 29th, they sent a sailor back to Halifax, probably through a smaller vessel. They were met by the Northumberland on the 30th, where it looks like a pilot was transferred across to tow them ashore. The Northumberland was one of the last 9 ships in the fleet to retain their mast. Another curious event on this day was the master's mate John Hatton had been declared dead at sea. Now the master's mate had access to the quarterdeck, the mess, and the gunroom, so he had access to supplies. This man came back on for the second expedition of Louisbourg on February 2nd, this time as a demoted rank as a landsman. Suspicious, no? He came aboard from the Barfleur. This is another one of those ships that was supposed to be serving at Rochefort, like the vessels they met on September 8th. We can see at this point the British fleet was in shambles. There were the 2 lost ships, as well as at least 12 others demasted. They were in no position to do any more fighting. Holborn sent most of the vessels back to England. This includes the Windsor, the Invincible, Captain, and the Sutherland. Some of the other heavily damaged ships supposedly set sail to England themselves. The Grafton, the Nassau, and the Devonshire. These ships arrived in England in early to mid-November. 2 ships supposedly went to Newfoundland first before going to England. This was the Bedford and Prince Frederick. So what happened? Did they suffer a mutiny? Was there even really a storm here? Records of this hurricane only exist in naval documents. Was it a real storm? Or was it a cover-up? We can see the French did not take advantage of the storm to attack the fleet while they were crippled. This is because they were hiding the illness and lack of ammo on board their own ships. Only 1 French vessel was listed as firing a shot, the Dauphin Royal, and it ended up sweeping Le Tonnant and another vessel into the shore at Royal Battery. Le Tonnant was one of their command vessels. The one that was not affected with typhus. The southeast seawall at Louisbourg was torn down, the city flooded. The other captain supposedly tried to petition the typhus commander to continue the fight, but he wouldn't budge. He was hiding his illness. A small vessel from Saint Esprit arrived at Louisbourg, informing them that there had been a wreckage on the shores. 200 men from the Tilbury had been put ashore there. Because of the storms, the French had to march overland, but the Micmac warriors got there first. Though the Micmac were quite violent against other British soldiers, they claimed they couldn't harm these people because the storm had brought them to their lands. Now, did these men wash up ashore? Were they evacuated? Or were they put ashore so the ship could be stolen? Will we ever know? What happened to Invincible after? Well, on October 1st, a lieutenant came on board from the Nightingale, probably to retain order. The captain's servant was discharged as sick and put ashore at Halifax. On October 2nd, another seaman was lost at sea. On October 6th, again in Halifax, another captain's servant was dead at sea. 1 more captain's servant was put ashore sick, with 5 seamen. Captain's servants were boys of at least 12 years of age, working as apprentices to the captain. They were usually rich kids taken aboard to oblige relatives or friends. It sounds like at this point the crew is in revolt, blaming those rich kids for taking the supplies. At this point, 9 out of 29 of them, a third of their rank, had been removed from the ship. On October 15th, a seaman they picked up from the Baltic merchant was lost at sea. Of Philpott's company 12 companions, Thomas March died on August 17th in Halifax. Nicholas Kelly and Roger Lee were discharged sick in Halifax. Gabriel Jones had transferred to the Arc-en-Ciel on September 19th. John himself was lost on the 26th. Henry Worsley was transferred to the command vessel on October 9th. Simon Perry and John Morgan were lost at sea near Portsmouth on November 7th. This is interesting because the expedition had ended on the 5th. Why didn't these two make it home? William Conway was discharged on November 9th. James Murphy was discharged on November 15th. Williams Horsburgh and Thomas Reynolds were discharged at Portsmouth on November 18th. From the Brotherly Love, Thomas Granton was lost at sea on November 2nd, 3 days before the expedition ended. George Verdi was discharged on December 23rd in England as per Admiralty order. From the Matilda, 2 DaCostas were cited as being under Admiralty protection. They were discharged on December 13th and the 15th. I'm honestly surprised they let the Frenchman, John Devereux, go without even being questioned. He was discharged as sick on December 6th. He made it all the way through to the end of the second expedition on Louisbourg. None of the American Baltic merchant crew made it through to the end of the interim. After losing the first man at sea in October, 1 man was remanded to the dockside infirmary, and 2 men were listed as being under Admiralty protection on December 13th. It looks like our French saboteurs were using the privates and the later boarders from this convoy as their scapegoats. What about those saboteurs? Peter Pittau, the German boatswain's mate who had come aboard the same day the French prisoner did but came from the sea, he was discharged on November 24th. Thomas Palmer, the secretary from the Arc-en-Ciel, was disembarked on January 16th, 1758. This is right before the second expedition on Louisbourg. Records show he went to New York and got married. He later served in the American Revolution there. The suspicious French lieutenant stuck to our Rear Admiral Hardy like glue. When Hardy transferred to the Royal William, he did too. His German mate left the crew in England on February 2nd, just before the second expedition on Louisbourg. The suspicious purser's mate that came from the Success, a William Clove, well, this man, he completely disappeared. There's no record of him ever disembarking. Hobson's extra battalion of troops, the 40th Regiment, disembarked on September 29th after they were picked up from the storm. But wait, before they were towed? John Davis, the ordinary seaman, managed to make it through all the way to the end of the second expedition, where he moved to the Royal George. The replacement captain's servant, John Bryan, he stayed with the ship all the way to the end of the second expedition and disembarked, it doesn't say where to, on March 6, 1758. Then there was the last 3 who came on board after the convoy met them. These men came on board from the Windsor. All of them transferred onto a bomb ship called Furnace, captained by a William Williamson on November 21st. We can see some of them stuck with the fleet, some of them gave up, and that one purser guy completely disappeared. So it doesn't look like they were officially caught. We can see after the expedition has ended, there were 2 suspicious crewmates that had transferred aboard from the Orford just before that hurricane. They were repeatedly on and off the ship between Orford and Invincible, sick and for supply runs. This implicates a new puppeteer, a Richard Spry, captain of the Orford. If we look into his history, he had been rescued by Charles Knowles after being captured near Antigua, so he maintained a political let's just say, allegiance to him, perhaps. Now, what about our puppeteers? John Rue went on to become captain of the Sutherland, and they led a successful siege in 1758. Maybe he was just trying to push aside the other guy to get glory for himself. Maybe they allowed him to take the fort with the least casualties. He was also present at the capture of Quebec in 1759. He died at Portsmouth in 1760. Captain Ory of the Success was asking for more leave, but was refused by the Admiralty. He took part in several expeditions in France. In 1763, he became a member of Parliament and bounced around in active service between 4 other ships. It looks like nobody had a clue about these 2 men. Richard Spry went on to participate in the second expedition at Louisbourg in 1758. He also participated at Quebec in 1759. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief for North America in 1763 and then the Mediterranean in 1766. He got knighted and retired in 1773, so it looks like he got off as well. For Peregrine Hopson, it's not exactly clear what happened to him. We know his troops went ashore on September 29th, and he was leading the ground forces because London was in New York. It says that he was recalled back to England before the second expedition at Louisbourg. Supposedly they feared for his health. Charles Knowles wrote a book to describe what happened at Rochefort to try and get his name and reputation back. He was apparently unfavorably reviewed and sued the reviewer for libel. He briefly captained the Royal Anne, but then he was removed from service. In 1770, he ended up joining the Russians. So, yeah. Did they find out about these sketchy events, and did they agree that it seemed kind of suspicious he disappeared during the time these vessels were there? Will we ever know? Let's get back to John Philpott. What about him? What happened? For a hint, there was a strange letter sent from a Lieutenant Parker of Charlestown to Governor Wentworth. We know John may or may not have been married to a Wentworth. The letter was dated for the year prior, October 3rd, 1756. It stated, "This day arrived here one Enoch Bishop, an English captive from Canada, who was taken from Contoocook about 2 years since. He left Canada 26 days ago in company with 2 other English captives. William Hare, late of Brookfield, entered into Shirley's regiment and was taken to Oswego. The other man unknown was taken from Pennsylvania. They came away from Canada without guns, hatchet, or firearms, and with no more than 3 loaves of bread and 4 pounds of pork. As they suffered much from want of provisions, his companions were not able to travel any farther than a little on this side of Coos, or Coos, where he was obliged to leave them last Lord's Day without any sustenance but a few berries. 6 men were sent out this evening to look for them, but it is feared they perished in the wilderness." Now Captain John Parker was an officer at the American Battle of Lexington. This was after Louisbourg. Historians believe he was never there, that he was stationed somewhere else or had not yet joined the military. His great-granddaughter was the one who had believed he had served there, due to Wentworth having received this letter. His relatives claimed there were letters sent from him when he was present at the Battle of Quebec in 1759. They claimed he was given the rank of a sergeant there. This is where we know John Rue was present. His father, Josiah Parker, served at the 1745 siege of Louisbourg. This implies now that our letter is coded, and this gives the place of origin of it. Enoch Bishop is not a real person. The only Enoch aboard the HMS Invincible was another John. So now we've got the name John twice. Kezia Wentworth had a brother Enoch. Was this an indication to do something by a shop? Was he expecting Enoch to be the one reading the letters? Contoocook is a place in New Hampshire. Philpot came from there. He stated the man was taken from about 2 years ago. We know Philpot registered to the HMS Invincible in 1756 after being transferred from the Yarmouth. The Yarmouth had been active since 1745. Philpot's last daughter was born in 1755, which would have been 2 years prior. He had to enlist sometime 2 years prior. He left Canada 26 days ago, while 26 days before the date of this letter was September 7th. That was the arrival of the convoy from England, in the company of William Hare, late of Brookfield. There was a William Hare born in 1736 in Brookfield. Someone last noticed his presence in 1755 in a unit that was sent to Nova Scotia. There is no record that he got married or of when he died. Entered into Shirley's regiment. Shirley's regiment was a foot regiment. We know John Philpot ended up on the ground forces as a footman, assaulting Louisbourg as part of the 22nd Cheshire. Was he trying to inform us he got transferred? Another possibility is he just ended up assigned to John Rue. Now, in 1746, John Rue commanded a ship called the Shirley. We know he went to Quebec in 1759 with the fake John Parker. One other possibility is Shirley himself had become the governor of the Bahamas. We know ships from the Caribbean region were participating in the chaos at the HMS Invincible. Is he trying to tell us Shirley had something to do with it himself? The other man was unknown from Pennsylvania. So Philpot ended up pressed with Hartley and one of the men from the Freemason ship? We know one of the men was lost at sea. Was this Thomas Granton? They came away from Canada without. He's talking about being out of ammo and food. He could be referring to the ship's supplies, Halifax, or the French fort. We do know the French ordered official rationing on September 28th. We also know they were losing supplies on board the HMS Invincible. Suffered much, his companions were not able to travel farther. The crew was defecting at this time. They were mutineering, they were giving up. Little on this side of Coos. Coos was Indian Territory near the No. 4 fort. Were they talking about landing ashore in Indian Territory, or the Indian forces terrorizing folks at Louisbourg? Obliged to leave them last Lord's Day. Sunday, September 25th is when the hurricane hit. Philpot was declared dead a day later. He was the only member of the crew to disappear on this date. Without sustenance but a few berries. Is this an analogy for money? Is he asking Wentworth to send finances, or complaining that they weren't giving them any food? 6 men perished in the wilderness. Between September 7th and September 25th, when Philpot left the ship, 6 men of the HMS Invincible crew died of illness or were lost at sea. Kinda scary if it was just a coincidence, isn't it? There was also a response from a Lord London concerning the defences at No. 4 replied to under the date of September 12th. This brave soldier bore his part, and it was certainly an important part in the mammoth undertaking of the sturdy pioneers who blazed the way for us who came after. Did he try to put a more important name on the letter to see if it got seen? Was he begging to come home from the war? We know Roger Lee left the ship on September 12th. Now, we know John Philpot was married to a Wentworth. It's possible that only important letters were going to be delivered during the war. So maybe they tried to send something to someone important enough so that it could be seen. The letter encoded details about the ship battle, where it all went sideways, the events leading up to Philpot leaving the ship, and perhaps the Freemason with him. It sounds like they caught him trying to mutineer, and they put him into service with the other man, William Hare, and possibly Thomas Granton. It sounds like Wentworth never got the message. Nobody came for John. he supposedly tried again to get word from Quebec, and again, nobody came for John. It's funny because it sounds like the real John Parker got elected as a militia captain in Lexington. Maybe Wentworth thought the man was going out of his way to impress him and promoted him, and the man just went with it for the money. John's wife, whether she was Sarah Roberts or Kezia Wentworth, moved on and married someone else. Sarah remarried a Deacon Moses Stevens, and Kezia married a Jacob Hobbs. A James Philpot was recorded as being a surveyor in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia in 1764, looking at Bunker's Island with 3 other men. The American Revolution hit in 1765. I don't think John, now James, was serving in this war. John Wentworth, born 2 years after John Philpot, served as a surveyor general in 1766. Maybe John Philpot had given him the idea, trying to get word home again, only to be left abandoned out in the wilderness in Canada. John's first daughter Abigail married in 1770 in the U.S. Her younger sister Rachel married her half-sister's mother's relative in 1771. At least his daughters were taken care of. In 1775, Wentworth was accused of being a loyalist to Britain. Though most of the city was sent to Halifax, his family was transferred to England. He avoided coming anywhere near Philpot. In 1783, when the war ended, 5,000 settlers came to Shelbourne, Nova Scotia, from the American colonies. It looks like this is where John Philpot went. He was looking for his family, but nobody came for him. His parents, his siblings, and his children remained in the United States as Americans. At the age of 48, John gave up. He figured he might as well start a new life. He married a woman named Judah, and they had a son John a year later in 1784. This is the man who I had spoken about in the previous podcast in Elgin County. He indentured himself with the Colonel Talbot at the age of 19. Perhaps after his father's experience in the military, he saw this as a better way to gain lands and a name for himself. There is a record of his brother being born to John and Judah in Shelbourne in 1785. His name was James. He served in the army for a little while to make enough money to purchase land and stay in Nova Scotia in a place called Heron Cove. He lived there with his wife and girls. The final daughter, Margaret, was born in 1787. In 1817, there's an obituary for an infant child between herself and a John Roach, who was working as a laborer in Halifax. In the 1842 Census of Canada, Dunwich region, it appears as if her family, now Roaches, moved out to Ontario to be with John. It might have been after John Philpot had died there. Maybe they were looking to gain an inheritance and they didn't know John had sons. They appear to be living around her brother's lot. It's kind of a sad story. John Philpot signed up with the military to serve his country and make a name for himself. He ended up being abandoned to politics, sabotage, and they tried to starve him. When he tried to escape, they pulled him back in and kept him trapped there for years. He reached out to family, hoping for help, but nobody came for him. Hopefully he found peace finding a new family in Canada. His children went on to be landowners themselves, at least for a time. Their descendants survive in Canada today. Perhaps that's the best any of us can hope for. I think that's it for today's episode of Musings of Rin. Until next time.